So I just want to let everybody know how the next couple of weeks are going to go before we start talking about today's material, right? So first thing to note, right, that paper proposal is due midnight on Friday. I do have office hours tomorrow if anybody wants to talk through it with me. I will be checking email if anybody has ideas they want to run by me. But yeah, it's going to be due by Friday at midnight. I can even probably be on campus on Friday if somebody needs to talk to me on that day. But you would have to make an appointment because I wouldn't normally be on campus on Friday. Sunday, we will have a vocab quiz due. We will not have a vocab quiz due the following week because I want you to focus on getting the paper done and prepping for the midterm. So we'll have a quiz this Sunday, but not the following Sunday. We're going to do a week of Victorian shit, and then you will have the midterm a week from Monday, right? So not this coming Monday, but the following Monday. Yes?
Will our midterm include anything that we're doing on the Victorian stuff for this next week, or will it only be all of our stuff from the Romantic?
No, we're going to focus on the Romantic period just to give you more time to prep and to study. So the stuff we're doing today is the last stuff that might appear on the midterm. So everything from Carlisle forward, that'll all be on the final, but don't worry about prepping that for the midterm. It's, you've had more time to sit with and absorb this material, so I don't want you to have to try to incorporate brand new stuff as you are trying to study for the midterm. Plus, I already gave you the sample keywords and questions and all that, and hadn't really incorporated Victorian stuff into that. So I don't want to do anything. I don't want to do anything that feels like blindsiding you or surprising you too much. Any other questions about upcoming assignments or anything? Okay, so the big thing to remember is that we're not bringing this book to class anymore after today, right? So Carlisle is in this book. Make sure you're bringing this one from now on until I tell you to start bringing the green one. And I'm also just going to note, right? I'm going to give you some reading questions to help you with the Carlisle, but don't freak out if you don't understand it. Right? Carlisle is notoriously difficult. I still assign him in this class because he's really important. He casts a huge shadow over the whole 19th century, but you're probably not going to get it on the first read. So don't worry about it if you don't. But please do come prepared with questions. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about anything?
After we submit our proposal on Friday, will you are you going to approve our topic? Okay, yes, you can write on this, or is it just you're grading the actual?
You are going to get feedback.
Okay.
I am going to say whether this is a good enough topic as it is, okay, or whether it needs work, or whether it needs complete rethinking, right? You'll get full credit just for doing the proposal, right? Just for submitting one. But odds are, your idea is not going to be 100% there yet when you're just giving me a 500-word proposal. So, you will get feedback on it, and I will try to help you make the idea stronger.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, cool. Then what did y'all think about the stuff you read for today? Wow.
There's a lot of blood.
Okay. A lot of blood, okay. I'm not going to deny that, yeah.
The last one really surprised me. I think it was the
We can
cremation
of a Hindu widow. Okay.
Yes, I did not know that was ever done. So I was like, oh my gosh,
Okay.
they just burned her to death. What is happening?
Yeah, so to give you some context for this, right, it refers to a practice that is called Sati. And Sati is known to have been practiced in the 18th century in some parts of India, not all over the country. And also, like, it's debated how widespread it ever was. But yeah, in the Sati Ritual, a wife would be burned on the funeral pyre with her dead husband. And given that young women were often married to much older, wealthier men, this meant this was often a young woman being burned, right? And this was also something that was typical in like high caste families of great kind of wealth and status, right? Or it was never common anywhere among anyone, but those were some who practiced it, right? And there's it gets a lot of publicity in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Actually, by the time Landon writes this poem and publishes it in 1836, it's already illegal in India. It's been outlawed. But I think that, well, let me actually ask you what you think of not of the practice of Sati, but of the poem and the way it's represented in the poem. What did you think of the poem?
I really like the words that she used. Were kind of beautiful.
Okay.
I mean, even though it's talking about something horrible, but like she's like describing like the jasmine yellow blossoms and the pleasant vanities and changing bright stones. Like those are like pretty words to describe something horrible.
If you hadn't read the title of the poem, at what point in the poem would you figure out what it is that is about to happen?
Almost at the end.
Like
The last.
like that.
Yeah, it's really only the last couple of stanzas, right, where you get any sense of anything violent here, right? I mean, what does it kind of look like she's being set up for most of the poem?
It looks like she's getting ready for like a wedding or her wedding.
Yeah, it looks like she's being set up for a marriage. And then we are told she is the bride of death, right? The bride. And yet the crowd that gather at her side are pale, and every gazer holds his breath. Eyes fill with tears unbidden for the bride of death. But, yeah, so the reason I wanted you all to read this poem is because this is a poem about an Indian social or cultural practice viewed through the eyes of a middle-class white English woman who is, of course, on one level horrified by the whole thing. Right? There is, particularly by the end of the poem, a strong sense of, pearl clutching. But she's also trying to fit this Indian ritual into familiar Western cultural codes. Right? So Letitia Elizabeth Landon was the editor of one of those literary gift books, right, that we talked about last time. That Mary Shelley published in The Keepsake, right? Landon was the editor of, what the hell was it called? It was Fisher's Drawing Room Scrapbook. And, it would have had the same readership, or a similar readership. Right, it's published around the same time. Shelley publishes her story in 1833. Landon publishes this poem in 1836. So we're talking about kind of like as the Romantic era kind of bleeds into the Victorian period. So this is a kind of transitional stage. And even when we look at those last couple stanzas where we kind of discover what's actually about to happen to her, can I get somebody to read those last two stanzas for us? She gives away the garland from her hair.
I can do it.
Thank you, Peyton.
She gives away the garland from her hair. She gives the gems that she will wear no more. All the affections, whose love signs they were, are gone before. The red pile blazes, let the bride ascend, and lay her head upon her husband's heart. Now in a perfect unison to blend, no more to part.
Thank you. So, does this strike us as particularly horrifying?
Not from the way it was written.
Yeah, right? I mean, yeah, if we're thinking about the way this is written, right? Does this look like a young woman being involuntarily dragged to an old man's bed and then to his funeral pyre? Yeah, what does this look like to us instead?
Almost like she's doing it willingly, like I don't know, it kind of, it's, I don't know, it kind of was like a ridiculous love story.
Yeah. This is depicted in terms like of romance, right? That this is the last gift that she can give to her husband, right?
Like Romeo and Juliet in a way.
Yeah. Two 14-year-olds who accidentally poison themselves based on a misunderstanding, yeah. But it's framed in specifically kind of like Western 19th century concepts of romantic companionate marriage, right? So, there isn't, the same kind of, sense of like this is sense that this is in any way coerced or forced on her part, right? And so there are a couple of ways that we can read this, right? One is that Landon is completely 100% bought into the typical middle-class ideology regarding gender roles and gender relationships that we've already talked about in this period, right? We discussed Dorothy Wordsworth and Mary Shelley, that it is the woman's role, like the best thing a woman can do is give herself entirely up for her husband. And that would be a valid reading of this poem, right? But is there another way we might read this that cuts against that ideology? How else might we view this woman's situation without changing anything in the poem or anything in the social circumstances under which it was written? What other, perhaps darker suggestion about romantic companionate marriage might it be making? I mean, what is this woman literally, voluntarily doing for the sake of her husband?
Giving yourself to a willing sacrifices.
Yeah, she is burning herself to death, right? While still alive. So you could also read this poem as a kind of critique of this view of marriage, right? That views it as this kind of total union of two compatible souls, right? Who are supposed to be one and all to each other. And, right, by the time this happens, right, the man's already dead, his problems are over. But it's the woman who's expected to do the sacrificing, right? The woman who's expected to give herself up rather than continue living on. And the reason I wanted you all to read this poem is because it's typical of an attitude that we see in British representations of Asian cultures in particular in the late 18th and early 19th century. So it's part of a discourse that scholars call Orientalism. Have any of you heard this term before? Any of you familiar with it?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
But hesitantly, yes.
Hesitantly, yes. Okay.
I've heard like Oriental like design.
Okay.
Like you design.
So Oriental, is a word that we no longer typically use, right, to mean Asian.
Right.
Right. It comes from the Latin, Orient, East, as opposed to Occident, West. And so Orientalism is, on the one hand, it was an academic discipline up through probably about the mid-20th century. It would probably now be subsumed into what we now call Asian studies, right? But this would be the older name for that. But it's also an artistic discourse. So generally speaking, we could call this Western academic and artistic discourse about Asia. And this really explodes as a field of study in the 18th and 19th centuries. One of the key figures driving the popularity of Orientalism as a discipline was an Englishman by the name of William Jones. Jones was a linguist professionally. Have any of you ever heard of the Indo-European language family? Okay, yes, so Jones is actually the guy who first mapped out that family tree of related languages, right? He was studying Sanskrit, which is like the classical literary and religious language of India, and he noticed a number of similarities like between Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, and that got him looking for kind of these loan words and connections in all of these other languages that he determined were kind of interrelated. But he was based in India for most of his career, and in 1784 he founded an organization called the Asiatic Society that was devoted to the study of Asian literature, culture, and history. And Jones was doing this with the ultimate goal of cross-cultural understanding, right? He was motivated by the idea that European cultures and Asian cultures, particularly South Asian cultures, could learn an awful lot from each other and ought to be more cooperative with one another. However, there was also a more kind of direct economic colonialist influence on a lot of this as well. A lot of the work that Jones and his colleagues did was either paid for or co-opted by a group called the East India Company. Have any of you ever heard of the East India Company before?
Yes.
I'm going to assume, Peyton, that you have heard of it, at least in Dr. Kutzler's class. Okay. Yes.
We actually learned about it on Monday, so it's just coincidence.
All right, cool. So what do you remember about the East India Company from Dr. Kutzler's lecture?
It definitely has to do with the tea imports into basically the whole, if you heard of the Boston Tea Party, the whole like the burning ships and
Yep.
you know.
Yeah, those were East India Company ships in Boston Harbor that the Sons of Liberty boarded and vandalized, right? And I think what a lot of people don't know is what they were actually protesting was not tax increases from Britain, but a tax cut that was given to the East India Company to make it prohibitively expensive for anyone else in the colonies to sell or trade in tea, right? So yeah, that's one of the key commodities that the East India Company traded in was tea, also opium, spices, indigo, and textiles. So these are the key things that they traded. So the East India Company is founded in 1600. So it's considerably older than the Asiatic Society. And from 1757 to 1858, they effectively rule most of India. In some cases, more or less directly. In others, through the cooperation of local rulers who are kind of glad to see the kind of commerce that the East India Company is generating in their territories, whatever they have to give up to get it. And the company, at its height, controlled half of the world's trade. So yeah, kind of like in the early mid-19th century, the East India Company this is not an exaggeration, controlled fully half of all global trade. So this was a huge economic conglomerate with British government backing, right? It's kind of like one of those corporations, like, yeah, it's a private company, but like the Royal Africa Company, many of its investors were highly placed in government, right? And so this gets us to sort of the other side of Orientalism, right? On the one hand, so we're just talking about it as an academic discipline, right? It sounds, at least on its surface, relatively harmless. The problem is, it becomes part of an attempt to control Asian societies through defining them. Right? We map out, we study these cultures, we break down and dissect these cultures in order that we can make definitive statements about them. That make our control over them much more effective, right? So it becomes part of a kind of ideology of superiority. And the arguments that I'm going to present here, by the way, come from the work of a guy, I think he's on your bibliography, by the name of Edward Said. who wrote a book in the 70s called Orientalism that is specifically about how artistic and academic Orientalism was used as a kind of system of control. So to give you an example of how this worked, right? It often involved a projection of negative characteristics onto Asians, as well as a tendency to view Asian cultural practices out of context through a specifically Western lens. So we see an example of that in the Landon poem, right, where she's using this Indian cultural ritual to make a point about Western marriage, whatever we decide the point she's trying to make there is. But on a broader scale, what tended to happen was that scholars and critics and artists would project characteristics they didn't want to see in their own culture onto these Oriental others, right? So what this is based on, the idea that this whole system is based on, is what's called alterity. And alterity is the condition of always being other or alien, right? Of always knowing that you are regarded in whatever society you happen to live in as the other. So, if the Englishman sees himself as industrious, what must the Indian be? If the Indian is the opposite other. What characteristic then would he project onto the Indian?
Laziness or something?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. If the Englishman is industrious, the Indian is lazy. If the Englishman is chaste, he is monogamous in his personal relationships, then what must the Indian be?
Polygamous.
Yeah, polygamous, promiscuous, right? Yeah. If the Englishman is even-tempered, what must the Indian be?
Chaotic.
Yeah, chaotic, hot-blooded, right, hot-tempered. And if the Englishman is civilized, then he defines the Indian, the other, as savage, right? So that's how this discourse actually often ended up working in practice. And this was not always intentional. I think, we can see, for example, when we look at the piece by Thomas Daniel in a moment, right, that I don't think Daniel is intentionally projecting these ideas onto Indians and onto Asians more broadly. But again, remember that ideology is one of those things that kind of like it's not. If you're just kind of going along with the cultural mainstream, you just tend to keep swimming in it rather than actually kind of question or resist it, right? So I want to show you an artistic example of Orientalism, and I want you to tell me what you think is going on here, right? What you think of it. So this is a painting called The Harem by the French painter Jean-Léon Gérôme. And I want y'all to just kind of like just take a moment and break down the features of the painting, because this is really very typical of Western Orientalist art. Whenever you feel confident to speak up about something, feel free to do so.
I mean, in most old Western art, they have a lot of naked women as like their symbol.
Sure. Okay. Yes. We've got nudes here, right?
Mhm.
We've got female nudes. So if we're thinking like in art history terms, there's nothing particularly unusual about that, right?
But in like the position where they are and where they're like looking up to, I'm guessing there's a man standing.
Yeah.
And he's like in he's in darker colors where they're, I mean, obviously his skin is darker, but they're more lighter than they're looking up to him.
Yeah, we've got pale women and a black man, right?
They're almost vulnerable to him.
And then you can see like the power dynamic.
Okay. So I'm going to question the power dynamic here a little bit, because what position does he likely occupy in the harem, would you think? What would be the only way a man would be allowed into a wealthy person's harem? Does anybody know what would have to be done to him first? The Sultan doesn't let you into his harem if you have working equipment. So this guy is probably a eunuch. And what is he holding out here to them? Do you know what these objects are that he's holding?
Is it for opium?
Well, or for hashish, probably more likely for hashish, right? But yeah, they're hookahs, yeah. I think, if you go to like a hookah bar in Atlanta, it's just going to be, like flavored tobacco, right? But if you smoke one in the Middle East, it will likely be hashish, right? So, yeah, so he is offering cannabis to these two women. What else do we notice about this? Does anyone in the scene seem especially active?
Not really, just when they're all just like hanging out.
Yeah, there's a pool in the back, right? But yeah, everybody in the scene looks kind of languid, right? And what makes this fairly typical of Western representations of Asia or the Middle East is that it attempts to kind of like consciously conjure up a sense of exoticism, right? That this is a place that is other, where people just kind of lounge around having sex and doing drugs all the time. Right? That's, in a lot of ways, the basic message of the picture. And we still, like, if you see, like, have any of you seen any, like those cheesy old, like, Sinbad movies from the 60s and 70s? They used to show them really late night on some cable channels. But you've got these movies with, like, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Sinbad, who is accompanied usually by a damsel of ample proportions in very, very skimpy outfits, right? And they're running around, fighting these stop-motion monsters. And like the whole idea is to promote, or it kind of plays into these old Orientalist tropes of portraying Asia and the Middle East as these lands of like exotic, sexy adventure, right? So let's look at some early examples of this discourse. Actually, no, I want to keep that on. Come back. I need to turn that off. I want to look at some of Thomas Daniel's paintings before we go in and start reading the piece that's in the anthology here. So Thomas and William Daniel were landscape painters who traveled through India and China and painted a variety of scenes in watercolor that they then published in a kind of coffee table book that was a huge bestseller throughout Britain, right? So, if you lived in a middle-class home in Britain, odds are there was a copy of the Daniels book in the parlor. You may even have china. You may even have had like china plates that had their designs painted on them, right? So I want to show you a couple of the images that they produced. I just want you to kind of like look and see if you notice common features, right? So what do we notice about this particular image? Let's try to break this down a little bit. Go ahead.
Some sort of structural ruin.
Okay, yeah, it's a ruin. And we have really, really big buildings, right? Very, very tiny little people. So I want you to keep that in mind as well as we look at the other pictures, right? The size ratios here. So here's another one. This is a painting of a famous mosque in Delhi. What similarities do you notice here between this and the other picture?
I mean, I think a lot of the lines of the architecture are very similar.
Okay. The other structure is probably Hindu, and this is a Muslim structure from a later period. But yeah, we do see what look like some ruins in the background here too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, what do we notice about scale?
It's It's almost as if the buildings are bigger to represent power over the people, because the people are just like ants.
Yeah. I mean, these are fucking elephants,
Yeah.
right? And they're tiny. And here's another one. Right, once again, we see enormous looming building in the background. This great big piece of monumental architecture that seems to be surrounded by a simple village, right? Like the village just kind of sprang up around this older building. And some more very, very tiny people and a cow. What do you think might be going on? Like I think the whole projection of power thing. I think you're kind of thinking along the right lines there, Peyton. What do we think about this when we consider that the title of the Daniel's book was A Picturesque Voyage to India by the Way of China? What do we remember about the picturesque?
It was like a form of,
Taming the sublime.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a way of taming the sublime and making it more palatable, right? Less scary, by putting it into a frame, right? You frame it in such a way that it seems less threatening. And the picturesque was a way of taming the sublime, essentially kind of for easier public consumption, right? So let's think about the implications of this for the Daniel's book, right? What essentially are they doing in their paintings? Who are the paintings for?
British?
Yeah, they're right. They're painting for a middle-class British audience, right? And so what are they giving that audience?
Like a look into daily life and culture and was this in India?
Yeah, all these pictures have been India, yeah. So they're giving the people who will buy their book back home a little taste of India, right? But if they paint scenes of daily life in India, just like people walking around doing their ordinary everyday shit, right? How interesting is that? Probably not very, right? That's like if you notice, most so-called reality shows aren't actually about normal people, right? Usually, the people that they're about are weird in some way, weird enough to make them interesting enough that we want to watch them. And this kind of thing operates on a similar principle, right? You don't want to give them what's normal about India, or how if you are presenting a picture of daily life, then you are presenting daily life in the shadow of enormous history, right? So what we're getting is an India and a China that are packaged for Western consumption. Right? Much like the East India Company is packing up tea and opium and incense and sending that back to Europe for consumption at home, right? So it's to kind of give this, the British public a sense of India as a place of, on the one hand, ancient grandeur, but also, in some senses, kind of what the paintings seem to depict modern squalor, right? That most of the people seem to live in small huts, right? A lot of the enormous buildings we see are ruins, right? So the sense that India's glory is in its past, not in its present. So it's also a way to help British audiences feel a little bit superior, if that makes sense. So let's look now at some of the things that that Thomas Daniel writes about.
You said that it was for them to feel superior and like having like painting big buildings of ruins. But like not too long ago, British people were building follies like that in their backyards to feel superior, but then you use it in a way in other places to make them feel inferior. Okay.
Because like if you're building it on your estate in Britain, right, you're spending money to do it. It's a sign of wealth and prosperity and God knows why taste. Right? But you're right. Yeah, it's an enormous double standard there. Yeah, an actual Chinese pagoda is for them a symbol of cultural decline and past glory. But you transplant the same structure to England, you build it in your garden, and it's a sign that you are a person of wealth and consequence. As is the hermit you're paying to live in a cave in your backyard, right? But yeah, I think like a lot of the people who would be buying these books are also the kind of people who are building follies on their property. Sometimes in imitation of images like this. So, good connection there, by the way. All right, so let's look at what Thomas Daniel actually says about these paintings and about his trip. And then if we have time, we'll move on to the Sati and Buchanan Jagannath stuff, which I hope we'll have time because that's actually really interesting and weird stuff. Okay. So can I get someone to start reading for us on page 933 from the earliest era of history?
Okay. From the earliest era of history, the attention of Europe has been drawn to the east. People vainly disclaiming kindred with other families of mankind have been implicated in the fate of distant nations and compelled to endure the unwelcome alliance or to enhance their suspicious friendship. By a series of political changes in other quarters of the globe, these countries have been rendered subservient to the feeling or policy of Europe. Curiosity has penetrated the veil of mystery that so long enveloped their civil and religious systems and their pompous pretensions to antiquity. Their venerable laws and institutions are now exposed to the sacrilegious scrutiny of strangers.
So one thing we determine about Daniel here is that he really likes alliteration, right? Pompous pretensions, sacrilegious scrutiny of strangers. But if we look at the first half of this paragraph, right, what does he seem to be saying about the Asian character? What characteristics is he assigning to them as a people? What is he saying that they're like?
Maybe that they're fake, in a way.
Okay.
Like they're pretending to be something. I don't know, because he says suspicious friendship, like in their unwelcome alliance, like as if they're pretending to be friends with them and they're just gonna go behind them.
Okay, so yeah, the fact that he uses term like suggests a kind of view of them as untrustworthy, right? And what else? Let's kind of keep moving in that direction here. What else, like in these kind of things that he says about Asian cultures? Where else might we detect here a note that he thinks of them as being somehow phony?
Like it says that they're vainly disclaiming like kindred to other families of mankind. It's almost like, well, we're just going to be better and like leave the world alone. It's almost like they're the ones who were somehow like thinking of themselves as superior. Yeah,
he's suggesting almost like they make themselves alien, right? they think of themselves as separate from the rest of the world, or somehow better than the rest of the world. And as such, but it's all towards cultivating an air of mystery, right? It's all in the service of pompous pretensions. So the tone of this from the outset is actually a little hostile and condescending, right? So let's look and see where he goes from here. Can somebody start reading for us from, it was an honorable feature in the late century.
I can.
Thank you, Kaylee.
It was an honorable feature in the late century that the passion for discovery, originally kindled by the thirst for gold, was exalted to higher and nobler aims than commercial speculations. Since this new era of civilization, a liberal spirit of curiosity has prompted undertakings to which avarice lent no incentive and fortune annexed no reward. Associations have been formed, not for piracy but humanity. Science has had her adventures and philanthropy her achievements. The shores of Asia have been invaded by a race of students with no rapacity but for lettered relics, by naturalists whose cruelty extends not to one human inhabitant, but by philosophers ambitious only for the extirpation of error and the diffusion of truth. It remains for the artist to claim his part in these guiltless spoliations and to transport to Europe the picturesque beauties of these favored regions.
All right, thank you. So we can stop there, right? Because I think this is where he's getting to the argument as to why what he's doing is good and valuable, right? So let's ponder some of this for a moment, right? What sorts of people is he describing coming out to India and China?
Philosophers.
Yeah, it's got philosophers,
Scientists, naturalists,
philanthropists. And of course, artists, right? And given that the philosophers are motivated by the extirpation of error and the diffusion of truth, do we think philosopher might be a euphemism for something else? Whose errors are they coming to extirpate? And whose truth are they coming to diffuse?
Coming to extirpate the British errors and the Western errors of truth, right? Because isn't the people from India and China are the philanthropists or the philosophers, they're coming to extirpate the error and division of truth. Western, their idea of truth, right?
Yeah, the Westerners are coming to diffuse their idea of truth, right?
Yeah.
Yes, they want to spread their idea of truth in India, right? So what are these philosophers probably really?
Maybe a missionary?
Yeah. When we talk about things like diffusion of truth, what we often mean is something like our religious viewpoint as opposed to other people's, right? So, do you notice anything weird about the language he uses here to describe this, the coming of this body of, supposedly, benevolent figures to India?
It's definitely the idea of bringing the civilized to an animal world, as if they're researching it in a way. That's what he means by scientists.
Yeah, we're going out into the wild and cataloging the creatures we find, right? Yeah. But I think even on the level of language here, right? Let's look at this the shores of Asia have been invaded by a race of students with no rapacity but for lettered relics. You notice anything weird about that sentence? Apart from the fact that we tend not to use the word rapacity much anymore. Strange about the language he uses here to describe their activity.
Well, it seems kind of strange that he would say invaded, since like he was talking
yeah.
about how it was like nobler aims than something like of a commercial sort of thing. So it's like
yeah, but he's still using the language of military conquest, right? And when he talks about, the artist claiming his part in these guiltless spoliations, do you know what he means by spoliations? Like what that refers to?
Like maybe since he was talking about how like these cultures have kept themselves as a mystery to all of us, like everything that we find, it's almost like it's the spoil, it's what we want
yes,
from coming.
He's referring to like the spoils of war, right? These guiltless spoliations, right, are the it's the the information and the artistic expression that will bring back from here to England. But when we talk about the spoils of war, right, you're still talking about, like, even using the word spoliations, right, you're still talking about theft. And this is still kind of a live issue in museum administration, right? I mean, like, there are stories, in the newspaper every few weeks about, how, another museum is being asked to return artifacts or artworks to a country from, which they happen to be looted, right? Like, I think the British Museum, for example, just had to just gave back a set of famous bronze sculptures known as the Benin Bronzes that had been looted from West African kingdom in the 19th century. What's the new museum in DC that the Hobby Lobby people run? I think it's
Museum
the
of the
Museum
Bible.
of the Bible. Yeah, they didn't inquire too closely into how a lot of the artifacts they put on display were obtained. So they've been getting hit with a lot of these requests as well, right? Like, actually, this is stuff that is, looted national property, right? That, the country of origin would like to have sent back. But yeah, the term guiltless spoliations seems to suggest that these Western scholars shouldn't feel bad about these takings, right? Because it advances general human knowledge and isn't that a good thing? And it's, well... But, it's,
we're alienating people and
yeah.
possibly disrupting culture, but it's for the betterment of everyone.
Yeah, and we're acknowledging that the taking isn't voluntary, right? It's not that we're being given a gift and sailing home with it. These are these spoils of invasion. Again, not to mention that a private British corporation, by the time the Daniels are traveling through India, has basically taken over the country, right? It's not even being run by a foreign government, it's being run by a foreign business. And a foreign business that sometimes sees fit to leave things be, and sometimes wants to make big interventions, right? Particularly, say like when there's something that affects publicity in a bad way for them, right? But I think that's part of what's going on with the whole Jagannath thing. And I'm using the term Jagannath here because that's the actual name of the deity that's referred to as Jaggernaut or as Juggernaut here, right? So Jagannath is a regional deity worshipped in some parts of the north of India. Where he is regarded as an aspect of the god Vishnu. Now, do any of you know anything about Hinduism? Are you familiar with who Vishnu is or what his function is in Hindu religion? Okay, so Vishnu is part of like the main trinity of Hindu gods, right? There's, they're kind of like considered like emanations of a single being, but it kind of splits into parts to perform separate functions. So there's Brahma, the creator, who creates